This is the first set of notes on ecology. Please notice that as we go through the notes that they are color-coded. Again, the vocabulary words are underlined and in red. The things you need to make sure that you write down are in purple. As you're going through your packet, make sure that you notice on the front of the page I've listed all the vocabulary words that are underlined in here. Most of them are words that you already know, like commensalism and parasitism and food web. And so I just put that there so you'd have access to the words, and you can write definitions on the page if you want to use it however it seems to work best for you. So we'll begin talking about populations. A population is a group of individuals of a single species that occupy the same general area. So when you have an area like your backyard, okay, there are a number of different populations that are in that yard. So if you talk about the grass, that would be one population. If you talk about the rabbits, that's another population. If you talk about the crickets, that's a different population. So all of those are different populations in the same area. The thing that you need to realize that in a population, those individuals use the same resources, they're influenced by the same factors, and they are definitely likely to interact with one another. Now, when we're talking about populations in a particular area, when we're talking about ecosystems, one thing that's often discussed is population density. Population density is the number of individuals of a species per unit area or volume. So a couple of examples here, the number of oak trees per square kilometer in a forest, the number of earthworms per cubic meter in forest soil. In your yard, it might be the number of pine trees that have been planted, the number of pansy plants that have been planted in your garden, the number of cats you have in your yard, and so forth. There are a lot of ways to calculate or count populations and determine population density. We'll work on a couple of these on worksheets, but sometimes you can't try to count every individual, which is very difficult to do depending on the size of your area. Oftentimes, ecologists use sampling techniques of various kinds to estimate densities, and again, we'll work on some of these on some worksheets that we have to go along with our unit. The big thing you need to realize when you're talking about larger areas is that within that range, the density of the local area within that range may vary greatly. So you have a number of populations in your neighborhood, for instance, and some people might have more dogs in their yard than other people, so the population density in that particular range would vary depending on the family's yard that you're discussing. Another thing that we talk about in terms of populations is the dispersion pattern. That means how they're spaced out in the area. And there are several different patterns here. We have clumped, uniform, or random. So in the clumped pattern, you've got clumps of individuals in different places. In your yard, if you have a couple of different garden areas that are planted, a couple of different flower beds, then you might have your, all your pansy plants planted together, and all of the 4 o'clocks and all of the monkey grass planted together, and so you would have clumped distribution of those rather than spaced evenly. In a uniform pattern, you're going to have the individuals are going to be more equally spaced from each other, and a good example of this is the trees in an orchard, if you or the plants that you plant in any kind of a garden. If you're talking about an orchard, like where you grow cherries and cherry trees, then your cherry trees are probably going to be pretty evenly spaced throughout the orchard rather than just randomly placed. And then in a random pattern of dispersion, they're going to be spaced in unpredictable ways. A lot of times this has to do with scattering of seeds, if you're talking about plants, or particular geographic requirements of different populations of animals. Here are some examples of dispersion patterns. Here's a clumped pattern with some starfish, and you see that the starfish in the population of this particular area have showing several different clumps in the circle here. A uniform distribution, this is an aerial view of people at a beach, and if you go to the beach and there are a lot of people there, oftentimes they're going to be pretty evenly spaced from each other. Some of them might be a little bit closer than others, but they're fairly evenly spaced from each other. And then random would be like wildflowers in a field. They're just randomly placed depending on where the seeds land when they're blown by the wind or scattered by whatever means is used to scatter them. Now, another thing that we talk about with populations is growth. and all populations have some kind of growth rate. This is a graph showing exponential growth. This is the rate of population increase under ideal conditions. Everything is just perfect for this population, whatever it happens to be. And as time goes on, the population increases due to increased birth, increased reproduction of whatever means, depending on what the population is. Are there deaths at the same time? Probably, but it looks to me like when you look at this graph, you can tell that the births outweigh the deaths quite a bit. Eventually, this population will reach a limit of growth, okay, that's going to restrict the growth. Some resource is going to be missing or something like that. That's what limiting factors are, something that limits the growth of the population in that particular area. Here's a graph showing logistic growth. This is where the population has slowed by limiting factors as the population increases. So if you reach the point where there's not enough food to eat, or there's not enough space for the plants to grow, or there's not enough, are there too many predators for the population of animals, whatever it is, the growth has slowed and come to a more or less steady rate. This line here that shows the steady rate that it reaches is called the carrying capacity. This is the maximum population size that an environment can sustain indefinitely. If the population gets above that, then you're going to have increased death because they'll have less food available, less space available, and so forth. There might still be some increase in population every now and then, but once you get above that carrying capacity again, it's going to cause increased death and a decrease in the population size or the population growth. Now, in logistic growth, like we just saw, the population will slow and eventually stop. And so what happens is this is when you have different kinds of limiting factors, and there are two different kinds of limiting factors. There are density-dependent limiting factors and density-independent limiting factors. The density-dependent limiting factors include competition for food, shelter, nutrients, things like that. If there's a limited amount of food, which there always is when you reach a certain point, then that's going to depend on the density of the population. The higher the density, the sooner you'll reach the limit, the amount of competition for food. The lower the density, then it'll take longer to get there. Shelter, space, nutrients, any number of different things can be limiting factors, but they're going to be limited based on the density of the population. If the population density is lower, it will take longer to reach the carrying capacity. In a lot of populations in nature, in ecosystems, there are other things other than living things that can cause population growth to slow or stop. And these would be called abiotic factors. That means not living. And so things like weather can affect it. So if you have something that isn't related to the population density, it's usually going to be something like that, like fires or storms or habitat destruction. Changes in the weather, global warming, all of those things can be density independent limiting factors. It doesn't matter how many individuals you have in your population. The point is, if something disastrous happens, a volcano, whatever, that's not going to depend on the population density. It's going to happen anyway. Some populations fluctuate regularly, and they undergo what's called boom and bust cycles, depending on lots of different things. An example of a population cycle is shown here between the snowshoe hare and the lynx. Lynx are large cats that are known to feed on snowshoe hares. You can see that when the lynx population is higher, the snowshoe hare population drops off. As the snowshoe hare population is lower, it causes a subsequent decrease in the population of the lynxes because there's not enough food to feed them, they can't raise their babies properly, and so forth. Once the lynxes start dying off, then the hares are less hunted and therefore can increase their numbers faster, which also makes more food available for the next generation of the lynx pups, and so lynx kittens. So you go on and on. Year to year, and there's an up and down motion they're related to the population densities of each other. In a community, this is all the populations that live close together for potential interaction. So like in your backyard, that would be a community rather than just a population. You have a population of grass, you have a population of trees, you have a population of various kinds of insects, worms in the yard, pets that you might have, and so forth. The boundaries of the community depend on what it is that you're looking at. So if you are an ecological researcher, you're going to decide on what the limits of the boundary are. If it's going to be your yard, then the boundary would probably be the fence. If depending on what community you're looking at, the boundary can vary a great deal. It can be very, very large, very, very small. A niche is how an organism uses the living and non-living resources in its environment. That's where you live, and that's your occupation within your habitat. The habitat is your physical address where you live as an individual organism, and your niche is how you use all of the factors that are present in that habitat to live. So whether it's the living things or the non-living things, whatever, the niche is how you use it. That's your job. When you have populations with niches that overlap each other, that's when you're going to end up with competition. And competition is going to have an effect on the carrying capacity of that particular area. Because those resources may, if they're competing with each other, that's going to deplete the resources more quickly. Here are some definitions for you for competition and the various kinds of competition, which include mutualism, where both populations get some good out of the relationship; predation, where you have one species, like the lynx, that kills and eats the prey, like the snowshoe hare; commensalism, where you have one species that gets some good out of the relationship and the other is neither harmed nor helped; and then you have parasitism, where the host is victimized by parasites or pathogens. Here's an example of mutualism that occurs in nature when you have reef building corals, and they have symbiotic relationship, a mutualistic benefit with various kinds of phytoplankton, the dinoflagellates or various kinds of algae, depending upon the group of corals that you're talking about. The dinoflagellates in this case get shelter from the polyp, and they produce sugars that can be used by the polyps, and they provide a lot of the energy for the polyps. The polyps provide the hiding place and a good location for the dinoflagellates to grow. Predation is going to benefit the predator but not the prey, and so the prey have to figure out some way to adapt to that situation using lots of different protective strategies that could include camouflage, like this frog here is camouflaged by the bark of the tree that it's sitting on. There are also mechanical and chemical defenses that you'll find in various kinds of plants and animals. Sometimes there are plants that are poisonous for a reason, and that keeps them from being eaten by the animals that live in that particular area. And then finally, an example of parasitism. Remember that you have parasites and pathogens included in this. And just to give you a quick definition, a parasite lives on or in a host, and the pathogens are disease-causing microscopic parasites. This is a plant that is being infested by various kinds of aphids, and these are definitely parasites on this particular plant, and you can tell by the leaves that are crumbling here because all of the liquids have been sucked out by the parasites, by the aphids. This concludes the first set of notes on communities and populations and symbiotic relationships.